I now give the floor to Ms. Sithembile Mbete.
Your Excellencies, I would like to thank the Presidency of Sierra Leone for hosting this debate on the maintenance of international peace and security, addressing the historical injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the United Nations Security Council, and for giving me this opportunity to brief the Security Council on this matter. In July 2005, at the African Union's 5th Ordinary Session held in Sirte, Libya, Africa's leaders adopted the Common African Position on the proposed reform of the United Nations, commonly known as the Ezulwini Consensus. Negotiated in the lush Ezulwini Valley of the Kingdom of Eswatini, this agreement was a response to the reform process initiated by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change. The Ezulwini Consensus expressed the desire for Africa to be fully represented in all decision-making bodies of the UN, particularly the Security Council. Africa's experience of the UN system over the past 80 years has been one of misrepresentation and under-representation. Misrepresentation and the perpetuation of narratives of the continent as a basket case of uncivilized and backward societies who are always recipients of aid rather than agents of progress. Underrepresentation in the exclusion of the continent from permanent membership of the Council, and inadequate representation in the category of non-permanent members. The CAP calls for Africa to have no less than 2 permanent seats with all the prerogatives and privileges of permanent membership, including the right of veto, as well as a total of 5 non-permanent seats. Mr. President, Africa's special claim to being prioritized in the expansion of the Council is threefold. Firstly, repairing the historical injustice of its underrepresentation in global governance. Secondly, recognizing African contributions in shaping the contemporary world order. And thirdly, the urgency of securing the legitimacy of the UN in the face of emerging threats to the maintenance of international peace and security. I will address each of these in turn. The goal of Africa's common position is to correct the historical injustice of Africa's lack of representation and recognition, but also the myriad historical injustices endured by the African continent over the past 500 years. To define these injustices, let's take a trip back in time to the West African coast in 1450. 1450 marks the beginning of over 4 centuries of European slave trade in Africa. It started with the Portuguese capturing Africans to send back to Portugal and to labor in its Atlantic islands. Over the next 450 years, the trade in humans would expand to include other European nations, primarily Britain, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain, and Denmark, competing for commercial glory and imperial domination. As Europeans laid claim over territory in the Americas and the Caribbean, the transatlantic slave trade was launched to secure labor for their plantations. Between 1450 and 1888, approximately 12 to 15 million Africans were trafficked across the Atlantic to produce sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton for the rapidly expanding global capitalist economy. These commercial crops enriched European nations and forever transformed the demographics of the New World. As African scholar Adekaya Adebayo argues, the West's industrialization was literally built on the back of African slavery. For Africa, the slave trade brought about devastating and irrevocable consequences in the form of depopulation, increased warfare to enslave more people, mass migration, and ecological damage that exacerbated diseases and food insecurity. This sorry history takes us to Berlin in 1884, where, enriched by the products of African slavery, European leaders gathered to partition and parcel out the continent amongst themselves. Hungry for the prestige and riches to be gained from imperial expansion, European presence in Africa was expanded into the interior of the continent, which was declared res nullius, or no man's land, despite the millions of people living there. Justified as a civilizing mission, This plunder of the continent cemented the destruction of economies, state systems, and cultures that was initiated by slavery 400 years earlier. One of those uncivilized Africans wrote in the Lagos Observer in February 1885 that the world has perhaps never witnessed until now such high-handed robbery on so large a scale. Africa is helpless to prevent it. It is on the cards that this Christian business can only end at no distant date in the annihilation of the natives. A major consequence of the Berlin Conference was the imposition of colonial states with borders drawn with a ruler and pencil that divided communities and operated on a logic of extraction and oppression of their populations. This continues to be felt in the unmanageable governance systems on the continent that are often incompatible with democracy and the rule of law. This has led to intractable violent conflicts. In the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, African conflicts have dominated the Council agenda. African subjects took up nearly 50% of the Council's meetings and 70% of its resolutions. As was the case in Berlin over 100 years ago, Africa is permanently on the menu, but Africans do not have a permanent seat at the table. Berlin also laid the foundations for the neocolonialism that continues to define Africa's economic relations with rich nations. Colonialism integrated African economies into the global economy on unequal terms to produce crops and raw materials to meet Western needs. This exploitative relationship continues today. The 2017 Honest Accounts report estimated that Africa loses $203 billion a year through illicit financial flows, profits by multinational corporations, and ecological destruction. With the continent receiving around $161 billion a year in loans, remittances, and aid, this makes Africa a net creditor to the rest of the world to the tune of $41 billion. A few decades after Berlin in 1945, world leaders gathered at San Francisco for the establishment of the United Nations. Of the 51 original member states of the UN, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and the Union of South Africa. Most of Africa was still under colonial rule. Concerns about the legitimacy of the structure, composition, and procedures of the UNSC were already evident in 1945. The head of Egypt's delegation presciently cautioned that permitting any power, great or small, to sit both as judge and jury in its own case does not contribute to building worldwide confidence so necessary to the success of a plan for world order. Indeed. But the seeds of freedom and self-determination sowed by the UN Charter spurred the liberation struggles of peoples throughout the continent, leading to the spread of decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s. This brings me to my second point of the need to recognize the myriad contributions made by African states to the evolution of the UN. Africa has not been a mere recipient of the UN's largesse, but an active contributor to its success. As more African states gained their independence, they agitated for reform of the Council and indeed succeeded in expanding the Council from 11 to 15 in 1965 with the addition of elected seats for Africa. African scholar Thandeka Nkiwane observes that despite their relative weakness, newly independent African states used the principles and established forms of international relations and global discourse to advance the cause of sovereignty and self-determination for Africans. Major milestones in the UN's practice and jurisprudence evolved through the activism of African states, including the declaration of apartheid as a crime against humanity and the adoption of the International Apartheid Convention. Personally, I, who was 10 years old in 1994 when South Africa democratized, would not be here without the efforts of other African states, including Sierra Leone. Over the past 60 years, Africans contributed personnel to UN peacekeeping missions, took up the cause of Namibia or Southwest Africa in the International Court of Justice, and took leadership in the organization, including 2 secretaries general, several undersecretaries general, as well as heads of various UN organs. Currently, the AU and regional actors oversee 10 peace operations comprising more than 70,000 authorized personnel spread across 17 African countries. African-led peace operations operate with greater flexibility, enable more rapid response to crisis situations, and have proven more cost-effective. African peace missions have upheld important UN norms by challenging unconstitutional changes of government. Within the Council, successive African members have cooperated as the A3 to spearhead informal reforms of Council practice, including sharing the pen on African issues, promoting closer relations between the UN and regional organizations, and using visiting missions to ensure security interventions are responsive to the needs of the people on the ground in conflict situations. The continent is ready and willing to take up greater leadership and to do so efficiently, effectively, professionally, and with integrity. Finally, the reform of the UN is necessary to ensure its legitimacy in an uncertain future of new and evolving security threats, like climate change, novel pandemics, and new technologies like artificial intelligence. Failure of the Security Council to solve major conflicts in the past decade, including Sudan, Libya, the DRC, Syria, Haiti, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Palestine, have dented the credibility of this institution. The UN faces a legitimacy crisis as Generation Z and Alpha are exposed to its impotence in real time on TikTok and other social media platforms. The youth of Africa are the future. 70% of Africans are under the age of 30, and despite living in poverty, they are digitally connected and sharing their direct experience of this institution's failures. Research by Indian scholar Rohan Mukherjee demonstrates that representational legitimacy is a necessary condition for good institutional performance. Because if institutions are perceived to be exclusive and unfair, members gradually reduce their participation and compliance with them. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, I beg your indulgence as we time travel to 2045 to a meeting in this chamber commemorating the 100th anniversary of the UN. At that point, Africa will have 2.3 billion people, making up 25% of the global population. Young Africans, as the most fit and able global demographic, will be the world's workforce and consumer base, keeping the global economy in business. Will the membership of the UN Security Council still look like it does today? Or will the diplomats seated here have had the courage to tackle head-on the power relations preventing meaningful reform? Bringing us back to the present day as we prepare for the UN Summit of the Future, member states have a timely opportunity to advance the agenda of Security Council reform and repair the historical injustice of Africa's exclusion. The AU Committee of 10's proposals on council reform provide a strong basis for Africa to ensure the continent is prioritized in the negotiations. The nature of global threats and the definition of international security have changed dramatically since 1945, and the Council must be adapted to enable it to respond to new security challenges. Such threats can only be resolved by an institution that represents the interests and perspectives of all humanity. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mbete, for that briefing.